Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement interview with expert series to help you create a fulfilling second half of life. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement, and your host for this program. Today, I'm delighted to tell you that my guest is Rick Moody, who's a very amazing person who I've actually met at a Positive Aging conference back in 2007. He's a pioneer in the field of aging, former vice president of education with AARP. He's the organizer of a number of previous positive psychology conferences and actually a hub person who knows everybody and has his in a lot of different ways. He puts together a monthly Values in Aging newsletter that comes out of the Fielding Institute. He had a prior one on politics that was really very helpful and important, I found, and now a weekly newsletter on aging and climate. He's author of a series, I think there's maybe about 10 editions of it now, of aging concepts and controversies. It's a terrific book. When I was teaching in a gerontology program, each year I would get the newer update of it, and it's a valuable contribution to the field of gerontology and aging. He's also the author of The 5 Stages of the Soul, and he's currently working on a book about aging and climate change. Rick, I am delighted that you're here, and welcome. I know you live in California now. Rick, why don't we start and maybe help us understand a little about how you've now moved in the direction of being so interested in climate change, or anything else you'd like to say here at the start.
I'll start with a little story. A few years ago, I was giving a talk at a senior center, global warming and that sort of thing. And after the talk, I was at the door. People were filing out, and an older woman, they're all older, of course, came up to me and said, "Oh, Dr. Moody, I just loved your presentation. It was terrific." She said, "I'm just glad I won't live to see it." I was a little taken aback by it, and I didn't even reply at the moment. And it wasn't until years later that I've come up with a reply to her, which is this. And what I should have said at the time, I didn't say, when she said, "I won't live to see it," I should have stopped her right there and said, "No, you've already lived to see it. It's happened right now. It's all around you. Let me show you." I didn't do that. And I realized that my message on all this, on climate change and aging, is really very simple. It can be reduced to 4 words: here, now, you, and hope. That's it. Mm-hmm. I'm not suggesting, Dorian, that we should end our conversation right now, but if the power goes out, as I referred to a joke earlier, they've gotten the message. But, of course, being able to say the message doesn't mean that the message gets across. That's my response to how I got interested in this. I've been interested in this a long time. I was an Eagle Scout myself and involved in a lot of nature things going back to 1960, which is when I got my Eagle Scout award. I'm now, this month, I turned 78. I've been interested in these issues for a long time.
First of all, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And it leads, I was actually thinking of different questions, and I was going to bring this up at the end, but now that you raised about being an Eagle Scout in the 60s, I'm going to start with that, and then maybe we can go forward. I'm going to go with the flow, too, because it's been interesting. I'm a product of the 60s, too. I think we were talking earlier. I'm a year younger than you, and our birthdays are a day apart. And being in the 60s, and I was out in Berkeley and part of the free speech movement, and what's been interesting is during the pandemic, I've been meeting monthly with my roommates from college. They were either roommates or then after we were I was in a co-op, and then we were in apartments together. But we've been talking a lot about now all of us being women in our 70s and the trajectory of our lives, and really thinking about how the 60s has impacted us. And when I've been thinking about it and preparing for this interview with you, I really want to get your thoughts on, many of us were really involved and active. The 60s sort of was a coming of age for many of us, free speech, civil rights, Vietnam War. And so and we are now, there's the silent generation, but the boomers is the elder population we're going to be talking about today with climate change.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's your sense? I'd love some of your sense of the impact of the 60s, and then I think there's been some complacency, for some continuing activism. And just a recent article I read in your weekly newsletter was really about the importance of the younger generation who actually tipped the midterm elections, and that those of our generation actually are out in left field. I don't want to say out in left field, but not involved in, or many aren't as involved in really understanding the impact that's going on in this world with climate change. It's a long-winded comment, but
hopefully it's left field and not right field. But
yeah, that's true.
You're making a really key point. People like you and I, and you were at Berkeley in the 60s. I was at Yale. I graduated in 1967. Right. But by the time I graduated, I had already been going on marches to Washington. I did my senior thesis at Yale on LSD, in both senses of on, and I was deeply involved in these kind of issues. But we don't want to generalize too much. I was very unusual among my Yale classmates, number one, maybe more so than at Berkeley for all I know. But if you really look at it carefully, many more people certainly among men, ended up in Vietnam rather than Woodstock. And if you look at the data in terms of voting behavior, as people have gotten older, the silent generation, boomers, these people are not voting for climate change issues or things like that. They were the highest level voting for Trump. And we shouldn't that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of other people, maybe like you and me. I'm very active, for example, with Third Act, which is an initiative generated by Bill McGibbon, great leader for this process. So there are plenty of people out there who can be mobilized and who do have a memory exactly the kind that you described. Wait a minute, we started out with something, let's say in the 60s and the 70s. What happened? In those years, people were not paying any attention to climate change as such. It was barely heard of. It's true, there was Earth Day in 1970, but this was another issue, environmental protection more broadly. It was not until much later that many of us, and I include myself in this, by the way, actually became aware of the enormous threat to our planet and to future generations. So you mentioned that the question of younger people, it's extremely important, in my view, and we can come back to this later in the conversation, for elders like you and me to connect with young people, because the young people are going to be the ones who are going to live to see the consequences of the world that we're leaving them. I published a letter to my granddaughter, who will be in 2094, the same age that I am now, namely 78. It's a letter of apology. What did we do wrong? How come we didn't fix things in time? Why didn't we pay attention? I'm not interested in promoting guilt. I'm interested in promoting action. So I think that's really the lesson of the 60s when, again, I'll say we, you and I, because we're just 1 year apart. When you and I wanted action, we need action today too.
How do we help people in our cohort recognize how important it is? I think that's happening more. Like for you, you said it was in the back burner kind of thing, and it was for me too. What for you crystallized sort of the importance of we got to do it now or it's too late?
I would say that I have two granddaughters, age 4 and 6, and that's the reason why I moved to California, to be near them. That's not a surprise. There's plenty of grandparents who do that. That's important, and we need to connect with people in terms of what they care about. There's an interesting discourse these days about obligations to future generations and what do we owe the future, and sometimes it's very abstract. I don't think people act on abstractions. Even if you give them numbers like it's 422 parts per million carbon dioxide, nobody really understands 422. It's great. We should go back to 350 and so forth. But those are just numbers. That's not what motivates people to act. What motivates people to act are experiences, personal connections. In the case of climate issues, even the word climate is probably the wrong word. There are very concrete things that affect us. I'll just name 4. There's fires, wildfires, floods, drought, and heat wave. These are 4 that I call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And they're things that people experience in their actual lives. Certainly I've experienced it since I've moved to California here. But if I'd stayed in Boulder, where I lived before, I would have seen it also, because just a year after I left Boulder, they had a tremendous wildfire. I had good friends who were evacuated in that experience. You might say, oh, gee, I left Boulder just in time. No, I got to California just in time. In 2020, as soon as we crossed the border from Nevada, we drove, I started seeing smoke. And by the time we got to San Francisco, I lived just south of San Francisco, smoke was covering everything, even during the daytime. My little granddaughter, age 4 at the time, my daughter was taking her to nursery school in the middle of the day, and 12 noon, and she looked up to her mom and said, Mom, how come we're going to school at night? Because the sky was so dark in San Francisco. And that smoke, by the way, from those fires blew way beyond California. It blew into Colorado. It blew to the East Coast. So
we had it back here, too.
You had it back in Boston. Exactly.
Yeah.
You're not going to escape the problem. That's what I meant when I said here, now, you, and hope. And back to the story that I began with the older lady who said, I'm glad I won't live to see it. I should have said to her, no, you're going to see it sooner than you thought. And you're going to see it in smoke, in fire, in flood. There are going to be heat waves. And when people realize that, it can be very depressing. They say, oh, my God, what can I do? That's the right question. What can I do? And each of us can do something. That's my message. Each of us can do something.
I want to get back to that. I wanted to just comment, just because it's heavy on my heart in terms of when you were saying about personal experiences. Just this past month, as you said, in California, there have been years of drought, and then there have been all the floods and the winds. And so, a lot of parks were closed, trees were falling down, branches, and a dear cousin of mine who I've connected with since COVID started, we have monthly cousins chats, and she was walking this a few weeks ago, actually, in Golden Gate Park, and a tree limb fell on her and killed her instantly. And it's just such a freakish, horrifying, devastating situation, and it's the issue of climate change all in a nutshell of just in 1 millisecond, lives can be devastated and changed. And it's something we all need to recognize. And there's such resistance of people to think about the human part. And I'm just sharing this because I'm still reeling the devastation of the loss of my cousin, and her son was just gotten engaged, and she was so happy. It was just devastating. But why is there such resistance to thinking about the human part of it?
Why is there such resistance to people doing advanced directives or even writing at will?
Good point.
You didn't tell your listeners today, but I actually am also, among other things, a biomedical ethicist. And I wrote the first book on biomedical ethics and aging, 1992, Johns Hopkins Press. I'm not trying to sell the book because it's out of date by now in many ways. But my point is people do resist things that are threatening. Aging is threatening. That's why people don't want to think of themselves as growing older. And by the way, I'm like everybody else, okay? I got a sweatshirt last year on my 77th birthday from my wife. As I asked for it, the sweatshirt on it says, I thought growing old would take longer. That's how we all are. we're surprised. Simone de Beauvoir describes this in her book, great book, The Coming of Age. We're all in that situation where things that are really threatening, whether it's aging or climate change, we don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it. And part of the reason is that we feel it's bad, it's hopeless. Let's just turn away from it. What's that old joke? Vaudeville, denial is not just the name of a river in Egypt. Denial is real, and we're all subject to it. We're all subject to it. Nobody's exempt from this. Ashton Applewhite, who I've gotten to know personally, who's a great critic and advocate about ageism, she would be the first to acknowledge that it's inside our own heads. And so part of my task in the book that I'm writing, the newsletter and all the rest of it, is to try to tell people a simple message. It's not too late and you're not too old. That's it. Mm-hmm. It's not too late and you're not too old, because the opposite is inside our heads a lot of the time.
So what can people do? What are some of the things? Yeah.
Talk about it. Talk about it with people, your family, your friends. Don't try to convince them. I'm not talking about propagandizing. I'm just trying to talk about acknowledging what's going on in yourself, including your fears, including things that you're doing to prepare. And when I say prepare, I don't necessarily mean avoid or even change. I happen to live right now, looking out my window as I'm standing here. And it's a beautiful sunny day here in San Mateo, California. But I'm located just 2 miles from the San Andreas Fault. It's possible that during our conversation, there could be an earthquake. It's very unlikely. I don't spend my time worrying about it. But I'm standing right now in front of my closet, looking at my go bag that my wife and I have packed in case the earthquake does come. But that go bag can be useful for other purposes. It was very useful actually during the atmospheric floods that happened recently here in California, which was related in some way or other to it was an extreme weather event. And we had our stuff together. Mitigation, that is preventing or altering or whatever, climate change, is one thing. Adaptation is also necessary. So we need both mitigation and adaptation. We don't need one or the other. That's binary thinking or false duality. We need both. And it's important for people to hear that, because they can say, oh, wait a minute, I can do something. That's the right answer. I can do something. And everybody's in a position when they can do something. Now, you asked the question, what can they do? The message I'm trying to get across is pretty simple, and that is, okay, you faced up to the prospect that we're already having here, now, you. Okay, what can I hope to do about this? And I have 3 answers. 1, you're a consumer, so start behaving like a climate-conscious consumer, the things you buy and eat and use your money for. Number 2, investment. You have a pension, you have investments, you're preparing for a financial situation, your retirement. Prepare for a green retirement. There are things you can do. That's number 2. And number 3 is citizenship. Connect with other people. You don't have to join Third Act or Elders Climate Action or whatever it is, but connect with people in some way or other. Just voting is not enough. You need to do more. We all need to do more. And we don't have to be heroes, but we have to do something. So those are my 3 messages: consumer, investor, citizen.
So can you elaborate more on the ways to prepare for a green retirement?
Yes. Right now, I'm very much involved with some work on divestment of trying to, and Third Act is one of the leaders on this, and so is Elders Climate Action and other groups around the country are trying to encourage big investment groups, Vanguard, BlackRock, and others, to avoid fossil fuel investments. That's a good thing, and we want to keep working at that. We did that in South Africa, but we've done it in other times in American history. It's a way of voting with your pocketbook. Fix My Funds is one group that's working on this. It's going to take a little while.
Is that what you said? Yep.
That's the name of a group that's working on this. And
Okay.
If anybody wants to write me after this call, I'll be glad to send you a short list of names of organizations and websites and places where you can get more information. Believe it or not, there's a lot of information out there, and it's sometimes controversial because the people who are funding the fossil fuel industry don't want their money to be cut off, but it can be cut off, and it sends a message. It's the old story, follow the money. And we can do this as individuals also. People can identify funding opportunities, investment opportunities to encourage better adaptation to the climate and mitigation of the threat of climate change. So we can do it as individuals and we can do it collectively. We don't have to wait for an imaginary future. We don't have to put our heads in the sand. We can act. That's really what I meant by investing for a green retirement.
And you're raising such important issues. How would one, is it talking to your financial advisor then to say, I want my money to not go to fossil fuel?
It's a good place to begin. Most people don't have financial advisors. They don't have wealth consultants or anything like that. Some of it you have to do on your own, but Dr. Google can help you out. Typing in something as simple as green retirement investment will lead you to all kinds of places. Now, some of these are not actually the real thing. There is such a phenomenon called greenwashing, in which products claim to be green, so-called, responsive, environmentally responsive, and investment opportunities claim to be green. Whether that's true or not is not so simple to answer, but it is possible. It's just like anything else, whether it's whether you're a consumer, whether you're an investor, or whether you're a citizen, you can be fooled. We've seen recently a guy was elected to Congress based entirely on fictitious resume. None of it was true. That's an extreme case, but there are less extreme cases in which people fall prey to misinformation. This is a big problem that we're having, and not just on social media. It happens all over the place. And the only substance and the only response to it is critical thinking. Another name for education, if you want to put it that way, but I don't want to frighten people. But you have to be cautious and critical. You can't just say, I read it on the internet. No, not true.
Absolutely not true. I think also, I always say no matter how much or how little money you have, if you're thinking about retiring or this next stage of life, it really is important to find a financial advisor that
it's a good idea.
Has a holistic.
It's a good idea. I agree with you completely, but the only reason why I'm cautious about it is that most people do not have anybody in that role.
Yeah.
And they often don't have enough money to pay for it and all the rest of it. But however much money you have, you need to think about, among other things, I'll just be very blunt, in the next coming years, certainly decades, we're going to see many fossil fuel companies with stranded assets. That's the technical term for it. Namely, they're going to be sitting on top of a lot of coal mines or oil fields, and they're not going to be able to sell it. Why is that? Because even today, and I have an article in my newsletter coming out shortly on this, coal was already more expensive than fossil fuels. So that means that and you may not even know what you're invested in, but if you're invested in things that are stranded assets, then your money is at risk. And if you're getting older, as you and I are, you don't want to be going down that risky road. You want to be more careful. So there's all kinds of reasons for thinking about a green retirement. And once people wake
can you
up,
say more about that? I hadn't even thought about this whole idea of the stranded assets and how that would impact. Can you say a little more about that?
Again, this is not an original idea with me. Anybody who's listening to this conversation can just type in those words, stranded assets, and you can get good guidance on this. If you look to a very authoritative source, which is Morningstar, the gold standard for evaluating and assessing different investment opportunities, mutual funds, and you're going to see that, and they're not selling anything, by the way. They're like Consumer Reports in the sense that they're being impartial. you're gonna find that there are risks out there, and you need to take account of that. This is just one of many risks. Every investment involves risks of some kind. People can learn. It's not rocket science. Let me put it that way. You can learn about these things.
What important things to learn about.
Behavior too. If you want food that's really healthy for a good old age, you can find out about it. Now, whether or not you act on the information, that's a second.
So interesting. And I was thinking when you were talking about moving from Colorado to California, it brought to mind that I hadn't thought that part of my exposure to the issues of climate and climate change, I think that's informed my constant awareness of it and concern about it, was that I did live in California. And one of my first memories was babysitting and the fires that I saw and being responsible for these children and seeing the fires in California and the earthquake, all the things there. And then I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, above the steel mills. And now in the Boston, Mass area, and there I'm confronted with somebody I knew was really involved in working on the initial wind farm, and then the whole resistance of the kind of NIMBY, not in my backyard kind of thing, the turbines kind of thing. But the fight in Florida, nobody wants the drilling there, but a lot of the representatives and senators in Florida want the drilling other places. When in fact, can you comment on kind of the NIMBY?
Well, really the key point in environmental advocacy, we often use the slogan, think globally, but act locally. And the reason for that is that you're going to have risks of hurricanes in Florida in a way which you do not have in the same way in Arizona, let's say. But in Arizona, you're going to have a risk of heat wave. You're going to have a similar risk in Florida, but maybe not the same in other parts of the country. There are going to be local differences. And when people say, don't put it in my backyard or don't have drilling here, that's one response. People understand that. In the case of the wind farms in your part of the country, certainly Massachusetts, Cape Cod, for example, this has been a big source of controversy. People don't want their view blocked by wind turbines, on and on. And we could have long debates about this, but the key thing to remember in all this is that there are going to be battles. There's going to be struggles waged around this set of issues. For the rest of our lives, no matter how long we live, if you and I are among the elders, we're in our late 70s, our time is limited. But whether we're talking 10, 20, 30 years into the future, all these struggles are going to be there again. And there'll be different struggles, but many of them will be local struggles. And we're going to see that around the so-called permitting issue in terms of electric transmission in the United States. Again, this gets very technical very quickly, but the message people can take away from this discussion is be prepared for struggles. It will not be simple. It will not be easy. It doesn't work that way.
So how do people get prepared for it, and what are some of the suggestions you have? I know you've mentioned a few already, but
the great novelist E.M. Forster said it in 2 words. He said, only connect. Only connect. Martin Buber put it differently. He said, all real living is meeting. And what that means to me is connecting with people on a personal relationship level. You and I have met in person, but even if we'd never met in person, we could have met on Zoom. And we've done Zoom events together. And even if we hadn't done on Zoom, we're having a telephone conversation right now. And there's people listening to this call who I've never met and maybe will never meet. Nevertheless, we can be personally connected if we're willing to reach out. And when people are not able to do that or willing to do that, they're putting themselves at risk. Isolation is a very big risk. And it's a very big way not to succeed at struggle, because if we don't struggle collectively, then we lose hope. We fall down a little bit. It's true in exercise. It's true on so many different levels of life. But then again, you and I know this because we're elders. People live through it. We've seen how people fall by the wayside unless they're connected personally. So that's my answer to the question. only connect.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Yeah.
important.
What are ways to connect for those that maybe are more isolated, particularly with people, peers, but also with younger people? Because I really so agree with you that we're on our way out in many respects, and it's our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, the younger generations that, that we do need to apologize to. I think you're right, but we need to connect with now. What are, in climate work and all, what are vehicles, what are ways, what are suggestions on how to really get in contact with and learn with and from the younger generation?
I try to follow my own advice. I don't always do that, by the way, but I sometimes fall off the wagon, eat the wrong things or do the wrong things. But in this case, I really try to connect with people who are interested in intergenerational work, and I'm part of a group called the Intergenerational Affinity Network, which is part of Co-Generate. Mark Friedman, who's a great voice in this whole area. And Mark, maybe you've had him on your show, but he recently renamed his organization from Encore, which really focuses on older people and what they do with their time, and that's a good thing, certainly. But he's broadened it to what he calls Co-Generate, and a big emphasis is on connecting with young people. So I try to follow that in my own life. I just got finished helping a 22-year-old college senior learn how to get involved with graduate work. I wrote him letters of recommendation. I just signed up and had my first voice lessons with a 32-year-old, I call her young woman, to me 32 is young, to teach me about singing. So I go out of my way to try to connect with young people and work with others, and there are plenty around the country who recognize that we will only succeed if we bring young and old together, and that's especially true on climate issues. We don't want a situation in which the young people feel that they are going to blame the old people for somehow leaving them a world that they can't live in. They have an understandable grievance, and we need to, in a sense, head them off and say, okay, let's work together. When I moved here to San Francisco, I signed up for the Sunrise Movement. The Sunrise Movement is just young people, but fortunately here in San Francisco, they have a group that's allied with them. They call it the 35-plus group of Sunrise. If you're more than 35, and full disclosure, I'm more than 35, I could join. And I went on a march with them not long ago here in San. We had hundreds and hundreds of people, most of them very young, but some old, like me. And that's the kind of connection that we need. I will say in passing that while I was on that march, I found myself teamed up with a 40-year-old woman who had lived in Paradise, California, which is the town where everything burned down. The most terrible fires in American history. And I heard from her what it was like to lose everything. Again, could these things happen if we didn't connect? No, they would never happen. We have to connect. You don't have to go on a march, but you have to connect with people nearby. Otherwise, we'll all die in isolation, which is not what we want.
I agree. It's one of the benefits I feel of being an older parent, in that my son is a younger generation, and through him and his cohort, it keeps me connected to younger generation. But I must say the wake-up call, I think, for so many people was when Greta Thunberg became such what I call it, a poster woman, a poster person about climate change. What?
Yes, an icon.
Icon, that's the word, icon.
I fully support that. But I will tell you this, in my book that I'm doing, I also have a whole collection of people I call eco-elders. And these are people like Joanna Macy and Jane Goodall, and others who are not as famous. Jan Hively is one who comes to mind. You may know Jan, too.
I think she's actually listening in. So
great. She deserves all my praise. I'm one of her great admirers. And there are others who are no longer living, people like Louis Mumford or Viktor Frankl. Some of these people I had a chance to meet personally. Some I never met. I never met Viktor Frankl, but I was in the audience when he gave a speech at the American Society on Aging, and you could have heard a pin drop. There were thousands of people listening to this, and there he was, this little frail old man standing in front, talking about man's search for meaning. And this is really crucial to what we're talking about. I wrote a book called The 5 Stages of the Soul, which is all about spiritual searches. And I'm all in favor of a spiritual search, but we have to be, as the Sufis say, to be in the world but not of it. And that's why I try to have 2 eyes, 2 hands, both on the spiritual side, seeking meaning, but also acting. I didn't say this so far, but what I do want to say is this question of hope. When people talk about is hope a good thing or bad things, is it delusion?
Right.
The environmentalist David Orr put it this way. He said, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And I love that statement because that's really the point. Hope is what galvanizes us to act. And if we do act, then we have reason to hope. If we don't act, then we just end up in despair.
That is so important. And can you say again his name?
David Orr, O-R-R. Okay. You can look this up. And again, if anybody wants to write to me, you can share my email address. I'm happy to respond to people. I'm trying to connect. I'm trying to follow that my own advice. You have forced to only connect.
And before we end the call, I'm going to have people know how to get in touch with you, both for email as well as for the newsletter you have. But let's stick with, because I know Joanna Macy, her work is so phenomenal. I want to hear more about this book you're writing, and maybe you could talk a little more about some of these other elders and how they've shaped some of your thinking and people that
everything that I have said, everything that I've said in this call is about nothing else other than the book that I'm writing. Okay. There's no mystery here. It's just the book is titled Climate Change in an Aging Society. I'm aging. Mm-hmm. I'm living in an aging society. I'm facing climate change. That's it. That's the beginning and the end of it. In 1975, when I was 30 years old, I wrote a letter to Louis Mumford, the great writer, the great environmentalist thinker, because I was teaching a course on the crisis of civilization at New York University at the time. And strangely enough, he wrote back to me. I was a nobody. I was a 30-year-old nobody. And he said, come visit me. So I spent a day at his house in Moody, New York, with him walking around his garden and hearing the story of his life. And he said lots of things, but one of the things that he said to me is that young people are looking for guidance from the old, and they're not getting it, and they feel lost. For me, my experience with Louis Mumford, who was 80 years old at the time or something like that, and I was 30, this was reaching across the barrier of generations, and that made a big impression on me. I don't know Joanna Macy, but my friend Kath Shoemaker, who's the director of Gray is Green, the National Senior Conservation Group. I happen to be board chairman, full disclosure, has been much influenced by her personal connection with Joanna Macy. And Joanna Macy, who's now in her early 90s, this is somebody who has really set the bar very high in terms of inspiring people to think about connecting personal meaning. And Joanna Macy is, of course, a Buddhist, with acting in the world to safeguard the environment. So we can do both. We have to do both. We have 2 eyes, 2 hands. We have two dimensions that we have to operate in.
Said so well. So and you said people could write to you and get awareness of a lot of the organizations.
It's very simple. I'm an open book. And you can find out, if you're looking for me, don't look for Rick Moody, because Rick Moody is actually the name of a very popular author. He wrote the screenplay for The Ice Storm and many other things. People confuse me with Rick Moody. People who know me call me Rick. My formal name is Harry R. Moody, Harry Rick Moody. So look me up on Amazon if you like.
Great. But also you just have been mentioning more organizations. So you've mentioned the Third Act. You've mentioned Elders for Climate Action. What are some other, the Gray is Green, what are other organizations, people that would be really helpful?
The big ones, whether it's Friends of the Earth or Sierra Club or others, Earth Justice, there are many great organizations. I contribute money to some of them. They're out there. What's recent is mobilizing elders on behalf of this. Third Act is only a year old. Bill McKibben, who's in his early 60s, came up with this after launching a very successful program called 350.org. And people can find out about that, again, Dr. Google will help. So these organizations are out there. I've mentioned the ones that I think are prominent on aging and climate. And again, that's why I do my newsletter and my other publications. I try to connect people. That's what I do.
So let me mention also that writing to Rick you can write to him and ask to receive his newsletter. Is that correct, Rick?
Yeah. I'll send you a sample copy. I send it to about 900, 1,000 people every week, but I only send it to people who specifically say, I saw your newsletter, I saw a copy of it, I like this, put me on your list. And if it's too much after a while, they say, I can't take this anymore. I take them off the list. I'm not selling it. It's not my business right now.
What are some of the other chapters in this book? I think you probably covered a lot of it in what we're talking about today, but what have I not asked about?
I have, and what you haven't asked me about, and what I don't really want to talk about, because it's not central to the book, is that the last chapter is on hope and fear, and it's narrated entirely through dreams. That is, dreams about climate, some of my own climate dreams, and many dreams about climate that I've collected from people around the world. And I do this because I think we talked earlier, Dorian, about the fact that it's hard for people to face up to things like death or aging. But sometimes our dreams can help us, show us things. Dreams show us what we already know, but do not yet see. And we see them in our dreams. I had a dream just last night, as a matter of fact, about Bill McKibben, who I've only met once on a Zoom thing. We were both panelists and a presenter in a session that happened that my friend Connie Zweig put on at Pacifica Institute here in California in early December. But of course, even before I was on that program with Bill McKibben, I knew about his work and I was part of Third Act. Again, my approach is connect with people and do things, but at the same time, remember that there's a deeper part of ourselves, whether it comes out in our dreams or our hopes, our fears. Hopes and fears are very much at the heart of the climate issue, and we need both hope and fear. We don't have to choose one or the other. Both go together. We're not interested in binaries or false oppositions here. There are lots of things to be afraid of, and there's lots of reasons to have hope. That's my message.
And also to not be in a constant state of denial, as you were saying before.
To not be, and the very story that I began with, the woman who said, I'm glad I'm not going to live to see it. That is a story about denial. Because she was, on the one hand, saying, oh boy, I got the message, it's really terrible. But she was also in denial by saying, I won't live to see it because I'll die sooner. Not true. It's already happening right now, here, now, you, and hope. But we have to overcome denial. It's a long struggle.
And I think from what I'm hearing from you, and I guess what I've always thought about too, is to really personalize it for ourselves and to really think about what I shared both about my cousin and the tree branch and living in where there were fires when I was in California and the steel mills in Pennsylvania and now in Boston.
Right.
And because I think that's what makes it real. Maybe that's part of what connects the hope and fear, or maybe it's part of the now you.
It is. The you is you, Dorian, Rick Moody. The personal is the political, as we said in the 60s.
Yeah.
And certainly the women's movement has made that point very much. Personal is the political. Until you face up to that, you won't be effective in dealing with the political. We need to do both.
No, I think coming full circle of, as you said at the beginning, fear, now you hope. And then you said, now we're done.
Yeah.
You know, but maybe we need to come back to that.
We've done more than that, but that's right.
Yeah. But I do think that's important. The other thing that you've mentioned a number of times, and I think it could be helpful for the listeners, because you mentioned good old Dr. Google. So the different things that people can put for alerts, it could be green retirement. What are other things you suggest that might, green investment you mentioned, what are other kind of helpful keywords that might get people?
There's some good groups out there that can give you advice about diet and about investments, about green retirement, for example. In terms of politics and acting as a citizen, I've mentioned some of the groups that are most concerned with aging and climate. And sometimes people say they should merge together. And I don't agree with that. I think we need diverse voices, but those diverse voices can cooperate and collaborate and join together, whether it's on marches or in campaigns. There's lots of things that people can do, both separately and collectively, and we need both. We need both.
No, I think it's true. What I hear and what I know I've reflected on for myself, but hear also from other friends of my age, and as I mentioned, my connections with my friends from Berkeley and FSM days, the reluctance to be out there marching during COVID these last 3 years, which have been really important 3 years. Do you find that? And
it's true, and I'm one of the people who are very sort of COVID cautious, so I don't go on airplanes, and I don't even go to my singing group. I take my voice lessons over Zoom. Other people will take a different point of view. I'm not interested in moralizing about this or saying you should be different.
Right.
But we're faced with we have been faced with a big threat, a big health threat in the last 3 years. And it hasn't gone away. Right. There's still 500 people in America dying every day from COVID. But we want it to go away. We wish it would go away. I don't think wish fulfillment is the answer. I think the answer is to be prudent, to be careful, and to do whatever we can to help ourselves and to help others. And that's really the message that I have about climate too, which is, yes, that's why I have hope. There are things you can do. It's not hopeless.
No, I think that's true. Any other, we have to pull it together in just a few minutes, but any other things we haven't touched on? You've mentioned, and I really look forward to your book in terms of some of the dreams of climate.
Yeah. We can talk some other time about dream work, because I've been a long-time member of the International Association for the Study of Dreams, and I've published a lot. I do dream workshops, things like that. But again, not everything is so easy to do during the COVID time, and even after that diminishes, there'll still be challenges. See the opportunities instead of the problems. Act on whatever is possible, and don't spend a lot of energy or time focusing on what you can't do, what's against you, et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty of things that we can do, each of us. Everybody is like in that situation.
I think that's a good final takeaway. So say again how people can get in touch with you.
It's H.R. Moody. That's H as in Harry, R as in Rick, Moody, M-O-D-Y, @yahoo.com. And again, I'm happy to send a sample of any of my newsletters. I do the one on positive aging, human values. I do the one on climate. If people are interested, once they see a sample, I'll put them on the list.
Great.
As I tell people, my advice is free, and it's worth every penny it costs. Look for lots of different sources of guidance, not just me. I'm just one of many.
One of the things that I think is wonderful in your newsletter is that you have links for articles, comment on them. There are also cartoons, humor.
Humor is very important, and I try to collect, believe it or not, jokes about climate change and humor. Because as Freud understood, when we have subjects of great anxiety, whether it's humor or I think of George Burns, who I used to watch on TV when I was growing up. We're the same age. I remember him, George and Gracie. When he was in his 90s, he was signing a contract to perform in a club in London, and they wouldn't agree to his 5-year contract. He said, okay, I'm not going to go. I won't perform unless you sign a 5-year contract with me. And so they asked him, they said, what's different for your act now that you're quite old? And he said, I asked for my applause at the beginning of the act instead of at the end. And he said, and I never buy green bananas. And I love that because he was dealing with death, aging, and he was using humor anyway. It was not denial, it was humor. So that's...
There's a difference between the denial and humor. I think that's really important. Right. So I do want to let people know when you're listening to this has been pre-recorded, but Rick has graciously said that if you have questions, you can you can write to him directly or submit them on the event page, and I will get them to Rick too. So I want you to feel like there will be opportunities to ask more questions. And Rick, thank you so much for spending this time with me and us. And now, you didn't say, when do you hope your book will be available?
Later this year. It's 2020. I'm in the finishing stages of it right now. Routledge is publishing it. We're making good progress.
Oh, wonderful. Congratulations on that, and happy birthday. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you
today.
for doing this call.
Care. Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.